Welcome to Hard Count Sports. We're very glad to be joined with PFF fantasy football analyst Andrew Erickson. How are you, Andrew?
I'm doing great, guys. I'm excited to talk about fantasy football because it's July and the season is starting to heat up.
It's on the horizon, yeah. Tell us, Andrew, tell us a wee bit about what you do at PFF and how you got into that.
What don't I do at PFF is a better question.
You carry them, do you?
So my responsibilities at PFF. So like you said, I am a fantasy football analyst. So that's my job. Like it's my legitimate job. I don't have another job on the side. This is my full-time gig. I wake up, walk into my office, which is the other room inside my house. And I'm on my computer. I'm recording podcasts, whether it's with my fellow coworker, Ian Hartitz on his PFF, on the PFF fantasy football podcast. It's doing the rankings. And it's really just diving into all the advanced numbers that we have over on PFF.com. Again, if anyone's familiar with PFF, again, the founder, Neil Hornsby, is from the UK. Him and Chris Collinsworth, founded the company. I think it's been, I don't know exactly how many years it's been, but it's been a while. They've been around, and there's just a lot of great information on the website that goes even beyond fantasy. Just NFL fans are obviously big fans of PFF, and it's my job to take what PFF has, all of the great numbers, all the great metrics that we're able to collect, and put that and spin it in a fantasy lens. Because a lot of times there are players that are good in NFL, good real life, and aren't really necessarily good fantasy guys, and vice versa. So it's my job to take all these information and put it into context so that fantasy football players can understand it in a really easy, digestible way. And sometimes I have to stop myself because I'll dive into the weeds on certain things. Like I need to come back up for air because I've gone way too deep and it's becoming need to be more granular with my approach here. But as long as things are action items, I always try to do that with the articles that I write. That's most of my content is articles, but a lot of different things over at PFF, but it's been a blast. Been there for just over a year now, and I'm excited for year two.
That's fantastic. A few of our listeners will be avid NFL fantasy players and know a bit about it, but some listeners won't be. Could you tell us a wee bit about, fantasy itself, how it works, how you select players, and also maybe give us an elevator pitch as to why you would encourage people to do fantasy?
Well, I'll start with the elevator pitch because fantasy football is just fun. That's the name of the game. It's a really fun way to watch NFL football because I can't tell you how many times I've seen a Thursday night football game between the Jaguars and the Tennessee Titans, and it's been just one of those games where it's 13-10 and you don't want to watch it. But when you have a fantasy player on your team playing in that game, you are that much more engaged with the product on the field. And that's really the biggest thing with fantasy football because it's not about the teams anymore. It's about the individual players. And I think that's really fun to be part of because I'm a players guy. Like I root for players most of the time, obviously. Like we talked about a little before we got on here, I am a Patriots fan, but look, man, it wasn't fun rooting for the Patriots last year. It really wasn't. So
imagine not.
So it was nice to have fantasy teams where I could root for players that I just liked on other teams and I root for their success. So that's how the game works basically. So you draft a team based on real NFL players and you roster that team and you watch them throughout the season. And when they score points, they score touchdowns, they catch passes in the real games, you get points and you basically go head to head with other people in your league who also drafted teams with players within the NFL. And it's just a lot of fun because you get the chance you can make trades. You can pick up guys off the waiver wire, which is basically a pool of players that weren't drafted. They're not on teams. And you'll find that you're going to be on the waiver wire a lot because injuries happen. I mean, last year was a friggin' mess because you didn't know who was going to play because people were getting put on the COVID list. So the waiver wire is a lot of fun to engage with every single week. And the thing is, that's all it takes. It's a weekly thing that you have to do to set your lineup. It's not every single day, unless you're the diehard. It's not every single day. So like these other sports, I can't speak necessarily to soccer, but I know with like basketball and fantasy baseball here in the States, it's like every single day you have to do something. And that can become a lot for something that's supposed to be fun. Because when something stops being fun, it's like, why am I playing this game anymore? It's supposed to be fun. So I think that's why it's the easiest one to kind of pick up and play. And yeah, I've played it for, I don't even know how many years now, but I love it.
Definitely.
You mentioned a wee bit about the waiver wire there. That is interesting because as the season starts, there's these players who kind of come out of the blue. No one's ever heard their name before. It happened a wee bit with Calvin Ridley last year. He wasn't great going into the season. No one was picking him up really. But as the season kind of progressed, the first 2 or 3 weeks went by, you realized that Calvin Ridley was going to come out of his shell and he was putting up major points on the fantasy realms. And everyone was jumping to get him from the waiver. Tell us this, Andrew. Is there any players this year, sleeper players to keep your eye on? You know, Calvin Ridley going into this season was a wee bit of a sleeper. Is there any players, you know, this upcoming season to keep your eye on in that regard?
Yeah, there's a lot of players that kind of fit in that category, but I was doing some rankings updates earlier today, so I'll go with one of the guys that's off the top of my head, and it's rookie running back Najee Harris for the Pittsburgh Steelers.
It's a good shout. It's a good shout.
And so what I like about him is, and this is something that you'll learn when you play fantasy football, is it's not always about who the most talented player is. That matters, but it's players that see the most opportunity. We say in the fantasy football industry, volume is king. Like that's what drives fantasy production, especially at the running back position. And the way that they're talking about Najee Harris, again, he's the running back from Alabama who got drafted in the first round this year for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The way they're talking about using him this next year is he's not going to come off the field. He's going to see anywhere between 20 and 25 touches per game. And traditionally, when running backs see that type of workload, they do really well in fantasy. Like they score a ton of points. I think it was not this past year, but 2 years ago, it was Christian McCaffrey, who was basically unstoppable every single week because the guy was touching the ball, 25 times a game. It's really hard to fail when you have so many opportunities to touch the ball and score points. So again, there's some concerns about the Steelers offensive line, but in all the research that I've done, I think that's a little bit overblown. It's really about the touches and the volume you get. He's involved in the passing game, so I'm not really concerned about the offensive line, Big Ben's shoulder, anything like that. So Najee Harris is definitely someone that, when people ask me, hey, who should I draft? Like he's one of the first names that comes to mind.
I've taken a mental note of that, and I remember that on draft night. Another player actually, he went through something, went through a trade, ended up in a new situation. Stefon Diggs saw a fantastic year on fantasy football last year and broke my heart in the Super Bowl. I went to bed on the Sunday night, 40 points up, woke up, and Stefon Diggs had he got 41 points, and I was coming runner up. So he was someone that, just ruined my week, ruined my year. But anyway, you see someone like that, he goes to a new situation. Is there someone that you have in mind coming into 2021 who could see a similar, a resurgence in his fantasy career going into next season?
The guy for me would be Kenny Golladay from he formerly of the Detroit Lions. And now he's on the New York Giants. Gotcha. And not a lot of people are loving the landing spot, again, which is kind of similar to what happened with Stefon Diggs when he ended up in Buffalo. It wasn't something that a lot of people were thrilled about. It's funny because they're, where they're going in the draft is kind of similar. Diggs, I think, was like a 5th or 6th round pick last year. And that's kind of where Kenny Golladay is, his average draft position is kind of resting up. But if you look at the way that the Giants, or at least the way that Daniel Jones was successful last year, he was successful throwing the ball downfield, and he was near the top of the league in terms of tight window throws. So he was trying to fit the ball into tight spaces, but he just didn't have the horses last year. He didn't have any. He had Darius Slayton, who's a former 5th round pick, as his number 1 wide receiver. And you're not going to find a lot of success when you're throwing to a day 3 pick. So the Giants added Kenny Golladay to the mix, and I think that he can step in and be the number 1 receiver on that offense. At worst, he's going to at least lead the team in targets, again, going back to the opportunity. And look, he doesn't have to be Stefon Diggs. Like, it's really hard for a player to be as good as Stefon Diggs was last year, but just based on where he's going as a number 1 wide receiver on an offense that should be a lot better next year. Just the fact that, Daniel Jones only threw 12 touchdowns. Like, that's not something that is necessarily sustainable year over year. The year before that, he threw 24 touchdowns in like 12 games. So I expect the production to increase. Again, the offensive line is the biggest issue with New York, but I do think that Daniel Jones will improve with Kenny Golladay now. Again, I think the fun stat about Kenny Golladay is I think past 2 seasons, he ranks number 1 in terms of fantasy points per touch. So when he touches the ball, fantasy points happen because he scores a lot of touchdowns and things like that. So Kenny Golladay would be someone that I am definitely high on next season. That's in a new situation.
Very good. Andrea, I think Kenny Golladay is one to keep your eye on because Daniel Jones is kind of reaching that point in his career where he needs to prove himself, in my opinion. And what better way to do it with a receiver like that? But now we're going to jump into name call round, which is where I provide you with a name, an NFL player, and you, Andrew, tell us where you think they will go in the fantasy draft or where they should go. And I'm going to kick things off with a running back. He's on the Jaguars. Now, the Jaguars drafted a running back this past draft, Travis Etienne, but I'm not going to go with him. I'm going to go with James Robinson, an already proven fantasy target that many people will be aiming to put on their roster this year. But his value may have decreased with Etienne coming to town. So I'm going to kick off things with James Robinson. Where do you think he falls in the fantasy draft?
I think that James Robinson will probably fall into rounds 7 or 8. So a lot later than what people would expect, but they drafted running back in the first round, like you said. And that means that James Robinson doesn't necessarily have the keys to the kingdom, I guess would be the best way to put it, or the keys to the backfield like he had last year. I mean, nobody was there competing with him for touches last year. He was a touch monster, and that's why he was good. So without that, I think that his stock is definitely taking a hit. I think that he's probably going to be more of a round 7 or round 8 pick.
Another guy who is an absolute stud in Travis. I've just put the cat out of the bag there. He's an absolute stud in fantasy. Every year he turns out some of the best production points per week. Travis Kelce. And you think of a tight end. You maybe are thinking one of maybe the 3rd or 4th round. Correct me if I'm wrong. But do you think Travis Kelce is worthy of maybe breaking that tight end stereotype and taking him that bit early just because of how productive he is in fantasy?
Yes, I think that if you want to draft Travis Kelce next year, you're going to have to take him in the first round. That's going to be the price because he's just, like you said, he finishes tight end 1 every single season, and there's just no other guy really like him. And
George Kittle,
like the markets. Yeah. And I think that's a good point you bring up, Ross, is George Kittle and Darren Waller, I think are much better values, as guys you can get maybe in round 2 or round 3 as opposed to Kelce in round 1.
True. Very true.
I'm going to go to a quarterback now. Now, quarterbacks aren't usually coveted so high in the draft unless you're Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson. But I'm going to go with a guy who has a few new targets to throw to. Ryan Tannehill.
Ryan Tannehill. Love Ryan Tannehill this year. Julio Jones, AJ Brown. Oh man, it's going to be it's going to be fun owning him. For him, I think that he's probably still going to go relatively late. I don't know if he's got this stigma on him from his days in Miami that people can't seem to knock, despite the fact that he has the number 1 passer rating in the NFL since 2019, better than Mahomes. So for me, I'll probably say like in that James Robinson range, probably even a little bit later. So maybe like the 9th round.
I actually selected Ryan Tannehill, got him off waivers, and he helped me win the Super Bowl in 2019. So I'm a big fan of him in fantasy. A guy I'm going to choose for you to share your thoughts on is someone who, in previous years had fantastic fantasy production with Drew Brees, but last year dipped a bit. Michael Thomas, where do you think he should be selected?
Yeah, Michael Thomas was the perennial 1st round wide receiver, which we usually see every single season, whoever was the best receiver the year before, and he got banged up. So for him, he's definitely fallen. I think that he'll probably end up being a round 3 pick. He's going to go behind all of the running backs, going to go behind Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, those top guys. But I think that the value in round 3 for a player that we saw just 1 year ago just dominate is really good value for him. But yeah, I think it's going to be round 3 for Michael Thomas.
Okay. I'm going to go with another running back. Now, this guy may be in a similar spot to James Robinson, but in my opinion, I value him over James because he has a quarterback who maybe the team won't trust to throw the ball around as much. I'm going to go Antonio Gibson from the Washington football team. Where do you think he'll land, especially in a situation that sees him as the main runner and where the quarterback mightn't have as much trust on him to throw the ball about, as I said?
Antonio Gibson will be a second round pick. He's going to be someone that's going to be highly coveted going into next year because he's got everything. Everything's there for the taking for him. He showed us the rushing upside last year. I mean, remember, he played, at Memphis, he was a wide receiver. Like he didn't even play the running back position. So for him to come into the NFL and off of 33 carries at his college profile and be a legitimate running back, the fun stat about him was he ranked number 1 in PFF's stuff rate metric, which basically is taking into consideration the percentage of runs that you have that go for 0 or negative yards. So he was the running back that got stuffed the least amount of times last year. He was always gaining positive yardage. So, and that's hard for a lot of running backs to do. And it's not like the Washington football team's offensive line was anything special, but Gibson really showed that. So if he can take another step in the passing game, which we'd assume that he can, because again, he played wide receiver in college. Antonio Gibson is definitely a player. Yeah. Second round for sure.
Yep.
I'm going to go with a guy who last year turned out to be a really good player to have on your fantasy team due to an injury. Jonathan Taylor, running back with the Colts. You had Marlon Mack went out injured, and him and Naheem Hines really took over the running game in Indianapolis, and he really became the RB1. Where do you think we should take Jonathan Taylor in our drafts?
So I think that Jonathan Taylor is more of a late round, first round pick. I think that's a more appropriate value, but I won't be surprised to see him command, I've seen in some of the drafts I've already done, I've seen him go top 5. I've seen him go 6 or 7. And at those prices, it's a little rich because the Colts offense has traditionally used a running back by committee. They've talked about, Marlon Mack is going to be coming back. You have Naeem Hines there, who also operates a lot in the passing game. So there are just a lot of ways where we could see Jonathan Taylor being really good, but not necessarily a game breaker because of the potential volume issues.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to go with a tight end now, Andrew. Now, this is the guy, in my opinion, who is very underrated. He was a pretty decent fantasy player in 2020. Logan Thomas, also out of the Washington football team. Where do you think he'll land in the fantasy draft this year?
I'm going to go back to my old reliable round 9. So he kind of fits into that middle range of tight ends where he's not one of the elite guys, I would necessarily say. He's going to have more competition for targets next year. The Washington football team obviously added Curtis Samuel, who's a big wide receiver that is going to command targets in that offense. They drafted Diami Brown, who's a big play wide receiver on the outside. So Logan Thomas really benefited last year from the lack of pass catching options outside of Terry McLaurin. So I do have concerns about whether he's going to see the same type of volume that he saw in the year prior. But still, the tight end position, it's not good. It's really hard to find productive players. So again, he's not going to be someone that is going to be super, super late, but he's going to probably be in that middle range of tight ends, probably around 9.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'm gonna ask a question here. Is there any pick that's too high to take Patrick Mahomes?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, especially with the way the quarterback, and this is a pretty common strategy that a lot of people use, is the late round quarterback strategy, where you find that there's a lot of quarterbacks that you can get really, really late in drafts, and sometimes even off the waiver wire. Like I know you mentioned, you got Tannehill off the waiver wire.
Yeah.
Like that's why it's not always the best investment to invest highly in a quarterback. And unfortunately, again, if you want to draft Patrick Mahomes, you're going to be fine with him. But from a value standpoint, it doesn't always make sense to take the top quarterback available, especially when we're seeing a lot of basically borderline elite quarterbacks enter into the league, where you have a Patrick Mahomes, but then you also have, well, would I take Patrick Mahomes in round 2 or round 3, or should I just take Josh Allen in round 4 or 5, or take Dak Prescott in round 6 or 7. So you're starting to see the value proposition better with some of these quarterbacks and get a little bit later, because realistically, yes, Mahomes is the best quarterback on planet Earth. There's no debating that. But from a fantasy points per games perspective, you have other quarterbacks, even like Lamar Jackson, who adds more to their game because of their rushing upside. So there are other ways that you can kind of deter away from, okay, I don't need Patrick Mahomes on my fantasy team to win the Super Bowl.
So whenever you do that, you leave your pick for quarterback, that opens you up to select other players in the earlier rounds. For example, you could end up with Dalvin Cook and Josh Allen, 2 fantastic players. Whereas if you drafted early, you could just have Patrick Mahomes and someone lesser.
In my opinion, Andrew, I don't know if you'll share this, but I think Josh Allen might be off the board quicker than you think.
Yeah, that was just one of the examples that I used.
Yeah.
I do agree that Josh Allen will probably won't be too far behind a player like Patrick Mahomes, but there are other quarterbacks. Again, I think for example, one of the ones that I think is really interesting is Jalen Hurts, the Philadelphia Eagles quarterback.
Yeah.
So, he has that rushing upside that is really coveted, for fantasy, because that's what he does. Like, he's a running quarterback, and they just score so many points away from the passing game that he's going to be someone that is like the perfect version of if you can get him in the 8th, 9th, 10th round, that's going to be awesome for your team.
Definitely.
We're going to quickly run through a few quick fire questions with you, Andrew. I'm going to kick things off on this by asking you to name your top 5 defenses going into fantasy in 2021.
Top 5 defenses. See, it's a good thing I did my rankings today, because I would have been illegibly prepared for this question. So I believe my top 5 defense. So number 5 is the Denver Broncos. And the reason the Denver Broncos is one that I'll dive into the most with, because the other ones are pretty simple to explain. So with fantasy defenses specifically, it's really important to look at the certain matchups that they have, because a lot of times you're playing a defense because they're playing a bad quarterback. Most of the time, that's how they score fantasy points. So the Broncos, first of all, they have a really good real life defense. If you look at PFF's, in terms of their secondary rankings, linebacker rankings, defensive line rankings, the Broncos have a top 10 unit across the board. They have top 5. They have the highest rated secondary heading into next season. It's no surprise they drafted Patrick Surtain. They have got a bunch of guys back from injuries. So it's definitely looking good for them in that vicinity. But the matchups that they have for the first 3 weeks of the season, week 1, they play the New York Giants. I know I talked about Daniel Jones, but at the same time, the guy is a turnover machine and gets sacked like consistently all the time. So
true.
That's going to be a week that you're going to start the Denver Broncos. And then the next 2 weeks, they play the Jaguars and they play the Jets. So against 2 rookie quarterbacks. Again, those rookies could blow us out of the water, and I could be totally wrong. But at the same time, I'm going to play a defense on a rookie quarterback making his 2nd or 3rd start in the NFL. I'm going to bet on that being in my corner. Again, they can put up points, but chances are they're going to probably make some mistakes along the way too. So I like the Denver Broncos as my number 5 defense. Number 4, I've got the Washington football team. I mean, that defensive line is just maulers. They just go all over the place, and they improved in the secondary. They added William Jackson from the Cincinnati Bengals, who I thought was a legit stud number 1 corner, and they already had a good secondary last year. So adding him to the mix, that makes that defense just at each level, they have elite players to build around. So I think the Washington football team is going to cause absolute mayhem for whenever they play, again, when they play the Giants and things like that, bad offensive lines, they're going to score a ton of fantasy points. Next is the Baltimore Ravens at number 3. Kind of like the Denver Broncos, they have a really easy schedule to open the season. I like a lot of their matchups. Again, they face week 1, they got the Raiders. It's like, you couldn't really ask for something better. I mean, Derek Carr, it's going to be tough. And then they play week 3, they play Detroit. Week 4, they play the Denver Broncos. So if it's Drew Lock under center, I mean, it's wheels up for the Baltimore Ravens to score a ton of fantasy points.
There you go, Zach. I'm sure you're not pleased to hear that.
I'm sorry. I hope it's Teddy Bridgewater. I really do. I hope it's Aaron Rodgers, honestly.
I don't think it'll make much difference.
So did I.
Los Angeles Rams are my number 2 defense. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, Aaron Donald, Jalen Ramsey, just guys are absolute monsters. And then number 1 it's Pittsburgh Steelers. Again, every single year, it seems like they have a top-fledged defense, and they're worthy of taking. If you don't like anyone on the board and you're like, I don't really like anyone, just take the Steelers defense. You'll be fine.
So no 49ers, no?
They're outside the top 5, but
Because, you know, when they're healthy, Andrew, you never know.
yes, it's true.
I'm going to sneak another quick question in. There's a guy in our league, and he's infamous for taking picks on his own team all the time. And I'm like, why are you keep doing this? It doesn't work. And he went, oh no, I have to stay faithful, What would your advice with team biased picks be? And maybe some tips on how to avoid doing that?
And I mean, yeah, you really can't do it. That's rule number 1. I guess it makes try to strategically approach it. Hopefully that your team biases are because you like the teams themselves, I guess, or that the teams are good. So it's like, hey, if you like the Chiefs, hey, okay, then draft all Chiefs players, like do it. But I guess it's really, I don't have any really tips to offer for someone that's doing that. But I would just say, look, if you play with someone in that league, then take advantage of them and try to, you know, get value, trade them players that they're going to overvalue on their own teams, and try to take advantage that way. And then again, it's tough love. I mean, they got to learn the hard way. And then hopefully by the time they get ripped and come in last place because they just were too stubborn to take Cam Newton out of their lineup after it realized that the Patriots offense is going nowhere with him, you got to make those choices.
To whoever, you know who you are. You heard that there, okay? That did not come from me. That came from Andrew. Andrew's an expert.
Here, that's on the internet now. He's out there. That's it's been exposed now. Andrew, before we get into the player versus player round, I'm going to ask you, in terms of the flex position in fantasy, is it better to use a running back there or a wide receiver?
I think it does depend on what you're looking for. So I will, my immediate response is to play a running back because their production, again, is much more, it's easy to project how many points a running back's going to score in comparison to a wide receiver. Again, it goes back to the workload thing. If this running back's going to see 15 carries and 5 catches, it's pretty easy to think, okay, he's probably going to score anywhere between 15 and 20 points. Whereas wide receivers, you find that they're way more volatile in terms of their scoring. Again, we talk about, it's basically like the Deshaun Jackson type of player. It's like he could go and score 30 points or he could score 0 points. So again, if you're head-to-head matchup, if you're facing someone and you're down by, let's say, like 40 or 50 points and you just need a boom week, okay, maybe you do go with the wide receiver. But if you just need a steady Eddie type of play, I'm always going to probably try to lead towards the running back position.
Okay. Right. I've got a couple of player versus players for you. So I'm going to say 2 players. I want you to take a player, okay, out of the 2. Right. Christian McCaffrey or Ezekiel Elliott?
Christian McCaffrey.
Okay. DK Metcalf or T.Y. Hilton?
DK Metcalf.
Okay. I'm going to go with the rookie quarterbacks from last year, Joe Burrow or Justin Herbert?
I'm going to go with Justin Herbert.
Ross, you've got a few, haven't you?
Yeah, I do. Jalen Hurts or Kyler Murray?
I go with Kyler.
Yeah, fair enough. Derrick Henry or Dalvin Cook?
I'll go with Dalvin.
DeAndre Hopkins or Justin Jefferson?
Hopkins.
Saquon Barkley or Alvin Kamara?
Barkley.
Wow.
Oh.
Why Barkley? That's a strange one.
Oh,
justify that. Justify that.
So the way I look at it is there's a lot of red flags with Alvin Kamara next year just because of the quarterback change. There's no Drew Brees. And if you look at a lot of splits with Kamara with and without Brees, he was up around like 29 fantasy points per game with Drew Brees last season. And then in the games that Drew Brees missed, Kamara was around like 14. So he saw like a major decline in terms of his production, and it goes back to the touches. Saquon Barkley is a 3-down running back. Yeah. Alvin Kamara is not. Like he's not. Okay. He's never seen over 200 carries in a season. I understand that he makes up for it with his pass catching. Again, this is not a knock on Kamara. He's a freak. He's one of the best pass catching running backs I've ever seen play football. But at the same time, he doesn't get nearly as many touches as Saquon Barkley does. Again, this is also, considering the fact that, I'm assuming that Barkley's going to be healthy. He's going to be ready go for the season. So again, things could potentially change, but if they both hit their ceiling type of outcomes, I would rather have Barkley than Kamara. Again, it's close. They're ranked pretty close in the rankings.
That's fair enough. It's fair enough. You've justified it, and you've maybe even influenced me there. I might have to go Saquon CD Lamb or Jerry Jeudy?
I'll go with Lamb.
Okay. Now going into some of the rookies from this past draft, Devontae Smith or Jalen Waddle?
Man, this is definitely the closest one that you've given me, and the targets tell me it's Devontae Smith, but the skill of Jalen Waddle is too tantalizing for me. So I'm gonna go with Jalen Waddle, but I don't feel great about it. It's razor close for me for those two guys.
Very nice.
And now, obviously, this would be a dodgy pick in terms of picking either of these two QBs to lead your team in 2021. But Justin Fields or Trey Lance?
Man, that one's another tough one too. I'm going to go with Trey Lance. I think that he has a better supporting cast. I mean, the 49ers, when you look at the leaders in yards per attempt past two seasons, it's friggin' Nick Mullins and Jimmy Garoppolo are up on that list.
Yeah.
Trey Lance just has a great system around him, and Justin Fields just doesn't. Again, I think their skills are pretty similar. I think Justin Fields is actually probably the better player, but I think that the 49ers just have a better system.
Yeah, we'll
see.
We'll see.
And to finish off, Andrew, we really appreciate you having on, and we've learned a lot tonight, and I'm going into my draft a lot better prepared than this evening. We always ask our guests when we have them on the Hard Count Sports this question. We have Super Bowl 56 in LA next year. Who do you think are the two teams that suit up and appear in that game?
Man, what a loaded question. Let's go. Not the Buccaneers again. It can't be the Buccaneers.
No, please, no more Tom Brady.
I'm gonna go with the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland Browns are gonna get to the Super Bowl with Baker Mayfield. Everything's gonna mesh for them, and I think they're gonna beat Ross. I'm sorry, they're gonna beat your 49ers.
Oh, you think the 49ers will reach the Super Bowl?
49ers have a Super Bowl roster. It was on their team last year. They got banged up. So
it just depends who the QB is, Andrew. You know, if Jimmy can play well, I think he keeps the starting job this season. I don't think they want to throw in Trey Lance too soon. But even so, I don't think they're Super Bowl caliber offense, honestly. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. I honestly think that the Chargers will be in the big game next year. So I do.
I don't like that. I don't like that. Another AFC West team in the Super Bowl that isn't my Broncos. I do not like that. But it's been an absolute.
The Broncos are in there if Rodgers is quarterback. I'll
change
my answer.
It's a big
It's a big if.
Definitely.
Andrew, it's been a pleasure having you on. If any of you listeners or viewers want to check out Andrew's work, he's over there in PFF. Is there any specific URL that we can plug there for you, Andrew?
Yeah, no, just pff.com and all my stuff. I tweet it all out. So I'm over on Twitter. I'm at Andrew Erickson _. Same thing on Instagram, TikTok, all of the social media platforms.
Of course.
Fantastic.
Go check them out, guys. Thank you so much for listening to this conversation. And if any of you are going to be playing fantasy football this upcoming year, these are some great takes to work into your team. And I know that I'll be taking Andrew's advice when it comes to fantasy. I'm sure you will too, Zach.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and have a good day.